Okay, I believe we're live. And today I just wanted to talk a little bit about an interesting sign that I saw as I was walking around in my neighborhood. And it's kind of funny because a lot of people who are Muslims, especially particularly Muslim apologists or those who are interested in dawah, they'll say the Quran has the clearest message. There's clarity in its message. It's so simple to understand. You know, one God, not three. Don't say three if there's one. Uh, there's Tawheed. Forget the fact that Tawheed contradicts another Islamic principle, i.e., the eternality of the Quran. But they like to spread this message that the Quran is simple and coherent and easy to understand, which is belied by the actual book. For those of us who have read the Quran from front to back, it is one of the most incoherent, poorly poorly argued polemics or pieces of propaganda that you'll ever come across. And it it's very logical that it would appear that way because it was put together by people who were ignorant of the subjects they were opining on, namely Christianity and Judaism and Holy Scripture, the Old Testament and the New Testament. So, and Muhammad's companions and the people that compiled the Quran, they were not that conversant in these subjects, and so it's very easy to understand why the Quran is replete with so many errors, scientific errors, historical errors, but also simply errors of logic and errors of exegesis and understanding who Jesus was, who the patriarchs were, and of course, this would be understandable if Muslims presented this as a book that was really compiled and created by men, but that's not what they say. They say it was created by God Himself, in their eyes, Allah. So you hear this a lot when you encounter Muslims, and I have a hey GW, I have a great example of how how not clear and how self-contradictory and just just absurdly unintelligible the Quran is. I have an example. Just hi Alejandro. Uh, yeah, it's one of the most boring books that you'll ever come across if you have the misfortune to read it. But I would recommend reading it for those of you who are interested in the subject, if for no other reason than to refute arguments made by Muslim apologists and Dawa experts. But I've read portions of Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, like tiny excerpts. I mean, they're huge, multiple. Uh, they're multi-volume collections. So I've read like tiny little passages, and you imbibe some of it if you watch David Wood's now suspended channel, uh, because he relies on the ahadith and he'll quote it because it's a lot. You get a lot fuller context of Muhammad's life if you read that or the Sirah. It gives you an idea of what Muhammad actually. Because if you just rely solely on the Quran, you'll have no understanding of Islamic historiography or what what the basis is for a lot of the. I mean, there are verses in the Quran, and I've mentioned this before, that have no real context. That's why it's so funny when Muslims argue that you're taking a verse from the Quran out of context. There is no context. That doesn't exist. That's the entire point. I mean, the Quran is arranged from long verses to short verses. There's no there's no context. It's not a narrative. That's the whole point. But yeah, uh, without the hadith, you won't understand a lot of it. Like there are verses, like there's a verse that says Abu Lahab and his wife. are condemned and they're going to burn in hellfire, but there's no predicate and there's no follow-up explaining who these people are, what their ostensible sins were, why they deserve hellfire. You have to read the background Islamic literature to understand that these were people who had fallen out with Muhammad. Therefore, he had this great enmity towards them. So just reading the Quran is not going to give you an idea of going to give you a good idea of Muhammad's life or what, and you're not going to understand a lot of it just because there's no context. And that's another reason the Quran is not clear. If you need to read thousands of pages of supplementary information, if you need to read thousands of pages of supplementary information in order to understand what's being said in the text, then that text is not clear. It's self-evident that it's not clear, and it's certainly evident that it's not divinely inspired, or as Muslims believe, divinely created, that it was handed down from Allah, from the heavens by Allah. If you have to read all of this work simply in order to understand passages in that book, it's not a clear book. Yeah, there's a lot of really dubious, kind of disturbing stuff. Although the Hadith are more interesting to read than the Quran. The Quran is repetitive and tedious, and like I said, self-contradictory. There are so many. For example, the rules on inheritance cover an entire page, and it's not. First of all, mathematically, it doesn't work out. Muhammad was not a mathematician, but also it's just tedious and boring to read. He was influenced by a Nestorian priest, and Michael Youssef has a good, very short video on his Leading the Way channel where he explains this, how this priest, the Nestorians were a heretical sect that was sort of dispersed and expelled, and some of them set up shop in Arabia and surrounding nations, and they influenced the thinking of Muhammad. And Michael Youssef describes this, and it's part of a larger message highlighting the problems with heresy, not confronting heresy when it starts to creep into the church, and also just the value of sound doctrine and studying. In order to get sound doctrine, you need to study the Bible. And he points out that one of the reasons we have Islam today is because you had these heresies that really weren't addressed sufficiently at the time. So yeah, one of Muhammad's advisors in spiritual matters was Nestorian. But getting back to the main point, and I don't know if you could see it, but it's basically this is a banner outside of the Muslim American Society. Now, the Muslim American Society is one of many branches of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is kind of the font for all contemporary jihadism, al-Jihad and al-Jamia Islamiyah, Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. Virtually all of these groups, even though many of them now reject the Muslim Brotherhood's underlying philosophy and their tactical approach to imposing Islam over the rest of civilization, even though a lot of them reject it, they have their roots. Almost all of these groups have their roots, these jihadist groups, in the Muslim Brotherhood. So the Muslim American Society is one of the many North American offshoots of that. It was an organization founded in Falls Church, Virginia, and they figured prominently in the Holy Land Foundation trial, where a group of Muslims who were ostensibly raising money for welfare, doing zakah, were actually bankrolling jihadist organizations. And this was a big case that Justice Department prosecuted. And the Muslim American Society and other Muslim Brotherhood affiliated groups were implicated, albeit somewhat indirectly, in these cases against the Holy Land Foundation and Benevolence International, I believe. So, but a lot of these groups, all of these groups, started in Falls Church, which is I believe, a suburb of Washington, D.C. Groups like the Council on American Islamic Relations, which is a little bit more famous, the Islamic Circle of North America. All of these groups are basically front groups for the Muslim Brotherhood. So the Muslim American Society has an outpost here, and they have a banner that says, "Stay home, stay safe, keep praying." Now, putting aside the dubious associations that this group has, I just want to address what's on this banner. So this is a banner they obviously erected after the COVID-19 outbreak in New York. And it says, "Indeed, with each difficulty, there is ease." And they cite the verse here, the chapter and verse, Surah 94, Ayah 6. So this is an excerpt of a passage taken from the 94th Surah. And it says, "Indeed, with each difficulty, there is ease." Now, if you look at that, this is one of those things where you hear this phrase carefully selected, curated from the Quran. You say, "Oh, that sounds really nice. That sounds very flowery and poetic." But again, if you actually stop and analyze it, it's just pure sophistry. Let's look at this. Let's break this down. "Indeed, with each difficulty, there is ease." Now, what does ease mean? The absence of difficulty. So let's restructure this sentence with the definition of ease. So it says, "Indeed, with each difficulty, there is an absence of difficulty." Now, does anyone have see the problem with that? with that sense, it's basically a it refutes itself. So he's this. If you look at this isolated, if you actually analyze what it says, it's saying, with each difficulty there is an absence of difficulty. Oh, hi, First Corinthians. It doesn't make any sense. Yeah, they don't recognize any of the prophets as Jewish. They think every prophet was a literal Muslim who literally worshipped Allah. And I've had debates with Muslims about this, and again, most of them will use any sort of tactic to deny the self-evident stupidity of Islam. They'll say something like, "Well, no, that means he worshipped the one God, and that God is Allah." And I had to tell them, no, those passages mean that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph were literal Muslims who literally worshipped Allah. That's the whole point of Islam. They have this theory that prior to the arrival of Muhammad, where everyone was in Jahiliyyah, there was, even prior to that, a monotheistic religion of people who worshipped Allah and were followers of Allah. And Muhammad was simply reinstituting that. And this is one of the reasons you see Muhammad refer to the sacred mosque in Mecca. This was when he was in Medina. So essentially he's saying this place, which was constructed by pagans, is sacred. Now, you have to ask yourself, why would he refer to a pagan place of worship as sacred? Because, again, Allah, the God he had created, was not was not a God that existed at the time that the Bible was written, or at the time that Abraham walked the earth. And none of the biblical patriarchs would have been familiar with Allah. But that's the Muslim philosophy. But getting back to the sentence, it shows you how ridiculous the Quran is. Even if you accept it at face value, you have a quote that says, "Indeed, with each difficulty there is ease," i.e., there is an absence of difficulty. Now think to yourself, how is that possible? It's only possible if you understand the absence, the removal of logic from the structure of the Quran. And I'm assuming some Muslims will look at this and say, "Oh, that's simply a bad translation that they're using." Okay, forget about the fact that these are Sunni Salafi Muslims who presumably study the Quran more than your average Abdul Abdul Q Muhammad who's trolling the internet. So, okay, forget about the fact that these people probably have a better understanding of the Quran, but say, okay, they just use a bad translation. What it should really say is, "Indeed, with each difficulty, there is relief," because that's what you find in some translations. Instead, as clear as mud, yeah. Instead of saying there, uh, with each difficulty there is ease, it would say, "With each difficulty there is relief." And you're thinking to yourself, "Oh, wow, I mean, that actually makes sense, because uh, relief simply means a feeling of reassurance." So what this is saying is, even though you may face trials, you may face temporal difficulties as you follow Allah. Even though you may face these things, He's going to give you a sense of reassurance. So yes, you uh, you endure some suffering and some hardship, but He's going to reassure you and um, reassure you. Now, there are a number of problems with this, and I'll go through them. One of the primary problems is that in Islam there's no eternal security. That's one of the defining features of Islam. And Muhammad Hijab, and probably the most honest part of his debate with David Wood, said, "Yeah, I might go to hell, and David might go to heaven." And that was one of the few honest expressions that he made during the debate, because there is no eternal security. And in Islam, Islam does not guarantee you. Islam, even in the Quran, it says people who are Muslims, i.e., they worship Allah, they proclaim Muhammad as the seal of the prophets, even those people will taste of hellfire. A lot of people don't know this, but that's what it says in the Quran itself. And Muhammad's companions weren't assured. I think Abu Bakr said that he wouldn't trust it. Even if he had one foot in paradise, he wouldn't trust it. So that's the type of religion he created. There's no eternal security. It's mostly a works based soteriology. So you have to keep pleasing Allah and keep doing something in order to satiate Him, and He might allow you into paradise, particularly if you engage in jihad and you martyr yourself. That's a guarantee. That's why you have so many Muslim suicide bombers and jihadists who kill themselves, because they want to be assured of entering paradise. And there's no assurance, no eternal security in Islam. So that's one of the major problems. So that replacing ease with relief doesn't work in that context, because that would be heretical to the entire idea of Islam, to say that you have eternal security and that Allah's got your back. That would completely refute the entire underlying core doctrine contained within Islam. So that's out. And a second and just as important objection is that Islam promises you ease. When they say ease in this circumstance, they mean physical relief. In other words, your suffering will be done away with. And Muhammad promises this throughout the Quran, that people who are Muslim will follow him, and they will get physical rewards or earthly rewards. They'll get booty. Allah will protect them. And one of the issues with this is that it's not true. If you if you read the Bible, you realize this is simply a a quasi-pagan concept that doesn't have any real basis in scripture. But also, it's refuted by the life of Muhammad himself. His suffering wasn't relieved. Of course, everyone knows that he died over the course of several years from eating poison lamb meat that the woman whose husband he murdered served him. And she served him that in order to prove that he was a false prophet. So that's so you can't use a Muslim hermeneutic and apply it to this passage and have the passage come out making sense, even if you replace the word ease with relief, which notionally it should make more sense, but it doesn't when you understand how the Islamic faith is structured. And when I say it contradicts scripture, I'll just give you I'll give you some verses that highlight this in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and it begins at verse 7. Paul says, "And lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. For this thing I besought the Lord thrice, that it might depart from me. And he said unto me, My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me." So Paul recognized that God wasn't there to solve every single problem that came about. Some of the problems were there specifically to remind him of the necessity of relying on Christ. And even though he prayed earnestly, and this problem wasn't there because Paul had sinned in some major way, he still was forced to endure it. He was forced to endure it without physical relief in order to make him to mold him into the type of servant that was necessary. So that is just one example. This is just one of the most glaring examples of how incoherent the ideology of Islam is. Not only is it contradicted by scripture, and it, from a logical standpoint does not gel, but it's also internally inconsistent. So it doesn't make any sense even within the context of Islam. Anyway, I just wanted to do a short video on that since it was something I noticed as I was walking around today, and I thought some of you would find this video useful. Anyway, I will see all of you soon. Have a good Sunday.